In the past decade, Wes Anderson has reached new heights with his new movies. He started the decade off with Moonrise Kingdom, which at the time became his most successful movie at the box office. He rounded it off with Isle of Dogs, his second stop-motion feature film. But the standout of his last decade was the Grand Budapest Hotel, which ended up getting 172 million from a budget of 25 million. By comparing this to his second biggest hit, Moonrise Kingdom, which grossed £68 million, one can easily see how important the Grand Budapest Hotel was for his career. Anyone who was scratching the surface would immediately stop there and consider that the Grand Budapest Hotel is the most important work of his. Yet by looking into the past, we can immediately see another candidate for his most important movie. In 2009, Wes Anderson was struggling. His past two movies, The Darjeeling Limited, which received mediocre reviews, and The Life Aquatic, which received negative reviews, becoming his worst reviewed movie to date. Of course, both have been reassessed since, and both of them have been seen in a more positive light. But the thing is, people wouldn't even be talking about Wes Anderson if it wasn't for his movie in 2009, Fantastic Mr. Fox. In many ways it redefined his style, making it to be one of the most iconic or the most iconic style in movies generally. In Wes Anderson's past movies there was a large use of handheld cameras for action scenes, but after Fantastic Mr. Fox, his style has changed to fit more of a stop-motion animation style. This isn't only in his animation films. Both of his live-action films since have used a style more like the stop-motion animation style, in which you can only move the character on an axis, or you can only have the camera in one place at one time in a scene. As stop-motion animation has the movie makers moving the characters behind the scenes rather than them moving themselves, because that would be really creepy. So obviously using a handheld camera is counterintuitive because it's not in real time. You'd have to not only animate the character but also animate the camera going up and going down, which just would be weird. So of course Wes Anderson has changed his style more to be like a dollhouse, for instance. Even though his older films exhibit this kind of feeling, the cinematography of his newer films has been refined to match the dialogue, the characters and the sets as more dollhouse-like. For instance, in a shootout in the Grand Budapest Hotel, there is exactly 0 handheld camera shots, unlike action movies today, which have quite a lot of them compared to Wes Anderson's movies due to the fact they want to make the audience more stressed. This is one of the many examples that stop-motion animation has impacted his style in film. Now I understand the importance of stop-motion animation, not only that, but also Fantastic Mr. Fox to Wes Anderson's career. We can now move on to the movie and its themes and its characters. How it teaches the audience is for everyone basically, of all ages, which is very rare nowadays, and how it portrays identity. The fantastic thing about this film, ironically using fantastic, pun not intended, is the fact that it is for everyone, and that its themes and characters can be applied to both what a child thinks and what an adult thinks. For identity, it's much the same. We have two characters experiencing kind of an identity crisis. Of course, Fantastic Mr. Fox himself, but Ash, his son, is also experiencing an identity crisis. Though they are both identity crises, they are about different things. Fantastic Mr. Fox's identity crisis can almost certainly be linked to how he doesn't want to be like a wild animal. Though of course he is a fox and exhibits all the attributes of a wild animal, he wants to be something which isn't truly himself. In the movie there are a few scenes portraying this. Fear of wolves, almost certainly representing his fear of himself. A wild animal, something which his entire life has been chasing him, and by the end of the movie he finally comes to terms with in the Canis Lupus scene, which is said to be the reason why Wes Anderson created the movie in the first place, and completes the arc which the main character went through for the last 1 hour and 25 minutes or so during the movie's plot. Ash's crisis is a lot more different from what his father is experiencing. Rather than being chased by his identity, Ash sits in the shadow of his father, coined as Fantastic Mr. Fox, something he feels he can never live up to. This is amplified when his cousin, known as Christopherson, arrives and is shown to have all the attributes of his father and is just as athletically brilliant as his father, something he has resentment towards as he hasn't been able to live up to his father's identity and hasn't been able to step out of his father's shadow. In the movie, of course, by the end he obviously steps out of it, when at the end where he saves his group and finally becomes something else, something more than Fantastic Mr. Fox could ever be, himself. And in these two examples, Fantastic Mr. Fox teaches his audience, teaches the audience that being themselves is always the best way. Rather than trying to be the human embodiment of perfection, it is far better just to be yourself, and not try to live up to some false dream which one can never achieve. It is shown from the end, in which Fantastic Mr. Fox lives in a hole even though he's proclaimed that he doesn't want to live in one anymore, yet obviously he still does by the end. This is not just because he has come to terms with his identity as a wild animal, but also to teach the audience that a perfect ending can never really be achieved, and is one of the few children's movies which doesn't end on a perfect note, but still ends on a high note. Boggis, Bunce and Bean aren't forever gone, they're just not chasing Fantastic Mr. Fox anymore. Fantastic Mr. Fox hasn't left a hole, but he still lives with his family and has come to terms with his identity. Even though the town has a new home and have beaten Boggis, Bunce and Bean, it doesn't mean that they haven't lost their old way of life, and perhaps all the negatives but also all the positives which came along with it. It's this failure which truly makes it stand out in movies in general, to be honest. Most action movies end on this perfect note which isn't truly much like reality, and this truly helps further its legacy rather than being just some random kids movie. It's a movie which teaches the audience, child and adult, and for that reason it was adored by critics, and for good reason. Thanks for watching.